Most people think China is competing with the United States. They think this is a race, a rivalry, a contest between two global powers trying to outpace each other economically or technologically. But that assumption is already outdated. China is no longer competing with the United States. They are designing a world where American power slowly becomes optional. And the unsettling truth no one in America wants to admit is this: China's strategy is not loud, not visible, not dramatic. It is silent, methodical, disciplined, and generational. While Americans debate quarterly results, China builds for 2050. While American politics changes direction every 4 years, China plans in 30-year blocks. This difference in time horizons is not a minor contrast. It is the foundation of why China's silent plan is working. And it is the single factor the United States continues to overlook. The misconception begins with how Americans interpret global competition. Most Americans think in terms of GDP numbers, military budgets, new technologies, sanctions, tweets, and headlines. But China doesn't measure progress this way. China measures influence by control, not by popularity. They measure power by who depends on them, not by who likes them. And they build dominance not through conflict, but through infrastructure, contracts, and long-term dependence. This is why the common narrative, China wants to overtake the US economically, is fundamentally wrong. China doesn't want to win the American game. They want to rewrite the game board entirely. To understand the scale of China's silent plan, you need to look at the systems they're constructing, networks so large and so interconnected that any country caught inside them cannot function without China. For example, in the last 2 decades, China has built or acquired stakes in 42 major ports across 34 countries. These are not random acquisitions. They form a global logistics spine that China can use to control the physical movement of goods. They form a supply chain map where crucial nodes, from the Middle East to Africa to Europe, depend on Chinese management, Chinese shipping companies, or Chinese financing. When you control ports, you control trade. And when you control trade, you control the environment other countries must navigate just to survive. Consider the domain of rare earth elements. 90% of the world's rare earth processing happens in China. These are materials needed for electric vehicles, fighter jets, smartphones, medical devices, satellites, and the entire technology stack of the 21st century. The United States has rare earth deposits, but the supply chain to refine and process these materials is overwhelmingly controlled by China. This is not an accident or a coincidence. It is the outcome of decades of investment in one of the least glamorous industries imaginable. While American companies sought short-term profits, China built long-term infrastructure. Today, the result is simple. If China stops exporting rare earth elements tomorrow, the global technological ecosystem collapses. And the United States has no immediate replacement. The same story exists in solar panels. China controls roughly 70% of the entire solar supply chain, from polysilicon processing to finished panels. In high-speed rail, China has built 26,000 kilometers of modern rail infrastructure. The United States has built none. In energy, China has invested over $400 billion across the Middle East, creating partnerships that tilt future alliances. And through the Belt and Road Initiative, China has extended influence into 150 countries, hooking developing nations into long-term financial dependence. These countries may not align politically with China, but economically, they cannot afford to oppose them. This is the foundation of China's silent plan. Build the system the world needs, then become the system the world cannot function without. It is a strategy designed to make the United States irrelevant, not through force, but through architecture. When China becomes the world's supply chain, when China becomes the world's infrastructure provider, when China becomes the indispensable partner for raw materials, construction, transport, and manufacturing, the United States is no longer the center of gravity. and influence always follows dependence. This brings us to a fundamental mirror moment the United States has avoided for far too long. America did not lose power because China became smarter. America lost power because it stopped building. Innovation is not enough if you don't control the pipelines, the minerals, the factories, the ports, and the logistics. The United States outsourced manufacturing, supply chains, and industrial capacity for decades. China quietly absorbed all of it. Today, the average American believes the US is still the world's factory. That belief is a relic of the 1990s. The reality is that nearly every major American corporation relies on Chinese components, Chinese factories, or Chinese raw materials. Even industries Americans believe they dominate, like pharmaceuticals and electronics, depend heavily on China's manufacturing ecosystem. The United States is not just competing with China. In many ways, America is supplied by China. This imbalance creates a dangerous long-term vulnerability. The US cannot pressure China without pressuring itself. China is fully aware of this leverage. They don't need to threaten the United States. They simply need to remind the world that they control the supply chain. If China shuts down exports of key components, American companies would collapse within weeks. If China limits shipments of critical minerals, the US military would struggle to build weapons. If China halts pharmaceutical ingredients, American hospitals would feel immediate shortages. This is not theoretical. This is structural. Bezos once said, "Your biggest risk is not what your enemies do, it's what you ignore." And that statement perfectly describes the current situation. The United States has ignored 2 decades of China's preparation. America ignored manufacturing loss, assuming technology leadership would be enough. America ignored supply chain concentration, assuming diversification would happen naturally. America ignored China's global infrastructure expansion, assuming these projects wouldn't last. Today, every one of those assumptions has collapsed. China didn't win because they moved faster. They won because America moved slower. Slow decisions don't just cost money, they cost the future. And while the United States debated and hesitated, China executed. They built, they expanded, they consolidated. They positioned themselves as the essential partner for any country wanting to modernize. And now, dozens of nations rely on Chinese technology, Chinese financing, Chinese engineers, and Chinese contractors. At this point, it's important to illustrate how this strategy works in practice. Consider a small but strategic country like Zambia. It holds some of the most important copper reserves in the world. Copper essential for electronics, renewable energy, electric vehicles, and modern infrastructure. China didn't invade Zambia. They didn't pressure Zambia politically. Instead, they offered something far more powerful: infrastructure. China built roads, bridges, hospitals, and power facilities. And in exchange, they secured access to Zambia's copper for the next 25 years. Today, Zambia's development, exports, and industrial growth are closely tied to China. If Zambia wants to build, they look to China. If they want to export, they rely on Chinese logistics. And if they want financing, China is the lender. This is not colonization. It is economic architecture. It is a model that binds countries to China without conflict, without force, and without the need for political alignment. It is a model the United States has no equivalent to. And it is one of the core pillars of China's silent plan. Use infrastructure as influence and use dependence as diplomacy. The United States has allies based on shared values. China has allies based on shared needs. And in a world where supply chains dominate everything, needs often matter more than values. This is why China doesn't need to surpass America militarily to reshape global power. They simply need to build the environment the world relies on. Once you control the environment, you don't need to win battles. You don't need to win elections. You don't need to win debates. You simply become the foundation other nations cannot afford to lose. And China is dangerously close to achieving that foundation. To understand the full scope of China's silent strategy, you must look beyond the industries and supply chains themselves and examine the incentives underlying China's long-term planning. China does not act impulsively. They do not build for headlines. They build for inevitability. Every port they buy, every mineral contract they secure, every railway they construct, and every manufacturing hub they establish serves a single overarching objective: create a world where China is the default choice. When a country needs infrastructure, China is the cheapest. When a company needs manufacturing, China is the fastest. When a government needs financing, China is the most available. When a market needs rare materials, China is the most prepared. And when the global system needs leadership, China is the most consistent. This consistency is the true threat to American influence. While the United States debates budgets, China executes multi-year industrial strategies. While the US struggles to pass infrastructure bills, China builds entire cities in the time it takes America to repair a single bridge. While the US reconsiders manufacturing incentives, China is already shipping finished products through a network it built, financed, and controls. America still thinks in terms of competition. China thinks in terms of replacement. And this difference explains why America keeps making the same strategic mistake, assuming they are in a race when, in reality, they are in a redesign. The next layer of China's plan is something far more subtle. China is positioning itself as not only the world's largest manufacturer, but the world's largest connector. Manufacturing is powerful, but connectivity is destiny. Whoever controls connectivity controls the flow of the future. This is why China has invested so heavily in things Americans rarely pay attention to: fiber optic cables, power grids, LNG ports, undersea pipelines, rare metal refineries, battery gigafactories, and high-speed rail systems. These are not isolated investments. They are links in a network designed to funnel global dependence back to China. Take digital infrastructure as an example. While the American public focused on social media scandals and smartphone debates, China quietly became the world's largest provider of 5G equipment. Across Asia, Africa, and parts of Europe, the backbone of telecommunications is increasingly built with Chinese technology. And with technology comes influence, maintenance contracts, data flows, cybersecurity dependencies, and long-term commitments. Once a country builds its digital foundation on Chinese equipment, switching providers becomes expensive, slow, and politically risky. This is not an oversight. It is a feature of the strategy. The same pattern is visible in energy. China has made long-term commitments in Middle Eastern energy production and distribution, with billions invested in Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and the United Arab Emirates. These investments are not short-term bets. They are strategic footholds that ensure future energy reliance. When the next global energy transition unfolds, whether through oil, solar, hydrogen, or advanced batteries, China intends to be at the center of the system. They are positioning themselves to dominate not just the materials, but the distribution, technology, and logistics surrounding global energy flows. Perhaps the most overlooked part of China's silent plan is its approach to time. Americans assume the future belongs to innovators. China assumes the future belongs to builders. Innovators create breakthroughs, but builders decide how breakthroughs scale. The United States innovated the smartphone, China manufactured it. The US led in biotechnology, China built the supply chain for pharmaceutical ingredients. The US pioneered solar technology, China turned solar into a global industry. The US conceptualized electric vehicle adoption, China built the batteries that power it. Innovation gives you a head start. Infrastructure decides who wins. This leads to a critical structural truth. America can innovate faster than China, but China can outscale America at every level. And in a globalized economy, scale is the real source of power. Scale determines pricing. Scale determines speed. Scale determines influence. Scale determines relevance. When you scale the world's manufacturing, logistics, transportation, and energy systems, you become the backbone. And when you become the backbone, everyone else becomes a customer. This explains why China does not seek military confrontation with the United States. They don't need to. War is inefficient. Dependence is cleaner, faster, and more sustainable. If a country is dependent, you don't need to threaten them. They will align automatically. If a company is dependent, you don't need to negotiate aggressively. They will adjust willingly. If an industry is dependent, you don't need to regulate it. It will shape itself around your policies. Dependence is not just influence, it is silent authority. The United States is beginning to recognize the danger, but recognition is not action. America has announced initiatives to bring manufacturing back home, to diversify supply chains, to invest in infrastructure. But these efforts face structural problems. American companies still prioritize shareholder returns over long-term capacity. US policymakers still prioritize political cycles over generational strategy. And American consumers still prioritize low prices, which inevitably lead them back to Chinese products. The intentions are good. The incentives are misaligned. China understands incentives far better than the United States does. They don't need to pressure companies to invest in China. The cost structure pressures them automatically. They don't need to force governments to work with them. The financing terms make it the only viable option. They don't need to enforce dependence. Dependence emerges naturally when alternatives are more expensive, slower, or uncertain. China's silent plan succeeds not because of coercion, but because the global system gravitates toward the most predictable builder. This gravitational pull creates long-term geopolitical implications. Countries dependent on China's infrastructure will hesitate to challenge China politically. Companies dependent on China's manufacturing will resist US restrictions. Industries dependent on China's supply chains will lobby against decoupling. Even US allies quietly acknowledge this reality. Japan, South Korea, Australia, and European nations are all balancing their security with the economic necessity of cooperating with China. They may not align with China ideologically, but they align economically. And in geopolitics, economic alignment nearly always wins. A powerful example of how deep this dependence runs is Europe's relationship with Chinese shipping and logistics. Many Europeans don't realize that some of the most critical ports, Rotterdam, Antwerp, Piraeus, have significant Chinese involvement. Goods flowing in and out of Europe often pass through systems influenced by, financed by, or built with Chinese participation. The United States has no equivalent network. America has allies, China has leverage, and leverage shapes behavior far more reliably than friendship. This brings us to the emotional spike no American wants to confront. Imagine a scenario where, overnight, China restricts exports of a handful of key components, not weapons, not technology, but essential parts used in thousands of products. A specific chemical used in pharmaceuticals, a particular microcomponent used in electronics, a rare earth oxide essential for manufacturing. The immediate shock would ripple across American factories. Production lines would slow, companies would panic, politicians would react, consumers would feel shortages within weeks, not because of a crisis, not because of conflict, but because the US has allowed a foreign competitor to become the backbone of its industrial ecosystem. The implications extend beyond economics. The US military depends on rare earths, advanced batteries, specialized alloys, and components that originate in or pass through China. No general or policymaker wants to admit this publicly, but it is a reality America must face. If a geopolitical conflict escalated, the United States would face a strategic disadvantage built not on military weakness, but on supply chain vulnerability. You cannot build modern weapons without modern materials, and China controls the pipeline for many of those materials. This vulnerability is what makes China's silent plan so effective. It doesn't rely on shock. It doesn't rely on confrontation. It relies on patience, scale, consistency, and inevitability. China is building a world where the cost of opposing them becomes prohibitive, a world where compliance becomes the rational choice, a world where American influence is structurally limited, not because the US lost its power, but because the system changed around it. Bezos once said, "The future always wins. Your job is to be prepared when it arrives." The United States is not prepared. The future China is building is arriving faster than America can adapt, and it is arriving through ports, factories, rail lines, digital networks, and minerals, not through warships or diplomatic announcements. China's silent plan is not about domination. It is about design, and the world is slowly being redesigned around Chinese capacity, Chinese logistics, and Chinese infrastructure. America still has time to respond. But that time is shrinking, and if the US continues to underestimate the scale of China's strategy, the next decade will transform the global hierarchy in ways many Americans still believe are impossible. To understand the final phase of China's silent plan, you must look at the one domain most Americans never consider: the power of consumption. The United States drives global demand. American consumers are the engine of international markets, with spending habits that shape supply chains, business models, and global pricing. But China has recognized a structural weakness. The US controls the demand, while China increasingly controls the supply. And when supply dominates demand, the system tilts toward the supplier. This asymmetry is the final lever China intends to use, not loudly but gradually, through strategic moves that make the American consumer dependent on Chinese products, not by preference, but by necessity. Look at the trajectory of global retail. From electronics to clothing, pharmaceuticals to automotive parts, the majority of what Americans purchase originates in Chinese factories, or in factories that rely on Chinese components. Even when a product is assembled in Vietnam, Mexico, or India, the upstream parts often come from China. This gives China a unique position. They don't need to dominate the final product. They only need to dominate the ingredients. And that is exactly what they have done. China owns the upstream. Upstream manufacturing is where control is born. Software can be updated. Products can be redesigned. But when the core minerals, components, and sub-assemblies originate in one country, innovation becomes secondary to dependency. This leads to a deeper insight. China's quiet objective is not to replace American brands. It is to ensure American brands cannot operate without China. When you supply the ingredients for someone else's success, you gain leverage far more powerful than competing with them directly. Apple, Tesla, General Motors, Boeing, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, Walmart. Each of these companies relies on Chinese supply chains at critical stages. The dependence is not emotional or ideological, it is structural, and structure is difficult to break. The next phase China is designing involves something few analysts discuss: pricing power. As China consolidates its control over minerals, manufacturing capacity, and logistics, they gain the ability to influence global prices. Small adjustments in cost structures could ripple across American companies. A minor increase in the price of lithium could disrupt electric vehicle production. A change in rare earth export quotas could slow down advanced weapon manufacturing. A shift in pharmaceutical ingredient supply could delay medical treatments. China doesn't need to apply pressure openly. The architecture itself produces leverage. But the most important part of China's upcoming strategy revolves around consumer-level dependency. China understands that American consumers expect speed, affordability, and convenience. These expectations are not just preferences, they are embedded behaviors. Any disruption to price stability or product availability could trigger widespread dissatisfaction across the US. China knows this, and they are positioning themselves to become the irreplaceable supplier for the categories Americans consume most: electronics, home goods, medical supplies, energy technologies, and soon, electric vehicles. Consider electric vehicles. The US wants to build a domestic EV industry, but China controls nearly the entire battery supply chain, from raw materials in Africa to refining and processing to the manufacturing of battery cells. Even if American companies scale production, the materials will still flow through China. The irony is unmistakable. To compete with China's EV dominance, the US will rely on Chinese materials. This dynamic is not temporary, it is structural, and structure determines the boundaries of competition. This brings us to a critical point. America's industrial revival cannot succeed without addressing the foundational problem of dependence. Reshoring manufacturing is valuable, but it is insufficient if the upstream remains controlled by China. Building factories is not the same as building supply chains. Supply chains require redundancy, resilience, and incentives aligned with long-term planning, qualities the US struggles to maintain in a landscape dominated by short political cycles and quarterly earnings expectations. China's advantage is not merely scale, it is stability. A Chinese policy direction can last 20 years. An American policy direction can change in 24 months. Businesses prefer stability. Investors prefer predictability. Entire industries prefer environments where long-term planning is rewarded, not punished. China offers this predictability. The United States does not. This difference, more than anything else, explains why global companies repeatedly choose China, even when geopolitical tensions rise. Another piece of China's silent strategy is its approach to global alliances. While the United States forms alliances through political agreements, China builds alliances through economic necessity. Political alliances can be debated, renegotiated, or resisted. Economic alliances rooted in dependence cannot. When a country relies on China for its ports, financing, energy grids, or critical infrastructure, the alliance becomes automatic. A nation does not need to align with China ideologically. It aligns through need. This pattern is visible across Africa, Southeast Asia, parts of Eastern Europe, and increasingly the Middle East. Nations accept Chinese investment because the alternatives are limited. Western financing comes slowly, with conditions and oversight. Chinese financing comes quickly, with fewer restrictions and immediate construction. For developing nations, the choice is clear. For China, this creates long-term strategic footholds in regions the United States once dominated. Consider the implications. If a geopolitical conflict arises where countries must choose between US interests and Chinese interests, the decision will not be made on ideology. It will be made on infrastructure dependence. Nations will not risk their energy grids or shipping capacity to support American positions. They will choose the path of least disruption, and China has positioned itself to be that path. This reality highlights the most profound insight of China's silent plan. Influence is not gained by force. Influence is gained by becoming the environment others must operate within. The United States has spent decades believing that military strength and technological advantages guarantee global leadership. China has spent decades building the architecture that global leadership sits on top of. Military strength matters, technology matters, but neither can compensate for dependence. And dependence is where China has built its strongest position. This leads to the question Americans rarely ask. What happens when the United States is no longer the anchor of the global system? The answer will not be dramatic. It will be gradual, subtle, and structural. American companies will face higher production costs. American consumers will encounter rising prices. Allies will demonstrate less alignment. Competitors will feel emboldened, and global standards, from energy to data to manufacturing, will begin shifting toward Chinese preferences. This transformation will not feel like losing a war. It will feel like slowly becoming a customer in a system someone else designed. Bezos once said, "If you want to understand the future, follow what becomes non-negotiable." In China's strategy, the non-negotiables are clear. Minerals, energy grids, transportation networks, manufacturing hubs, ports, and digital infrastructure. These are the pillars of the next century, and China is systematically embedding itself into each one. The United States still leads in innovation, military capabilities, and global cultural influence. But none of these strengths matter if the physical backbone of the world is controlled by a different power. China's final objective is not domination. It is centralization. They want to position themselves as the center of global production, global energy, global logistics, and global consumption patterns. In that environment, American leadership becomes optional. Influence becomes fragmented. Power becomes diluted. And the global system begins to orbit around a new gravitational center. There is still time for the United States to respond, but not much. The next decade will determine whether America rebuilds its industrial capacity, diversifies its supply chains, and reestablishes long-term strategy. The challenge is immense, but not insurmountable. What's required is not rhetoric, but rebuilding, not debate, but execution. Not short-term incentives, but generational planning. The question is not whether the United States can do this. The question is whether it will. Because while America is waking up to the scale of China's plan, China is already preparing its next move, a move that targets the one thing Americans cannot live without: consumption. The next phase will not focus on controlling factories or ports. It will focus on shaping the choices of the American consumer. And when that happens, the shockwave will be global. The world is shifting, the architecture is evolving, and China's silent plan, after years of patience, discipline, and scale, is nearing its peak influence. The future is being built, quietly. And the question the United States must confront now is simple. Who will own the system the world depends on? Because whoever controls that system controls the century.